Think about the last time something went badly wrong. Not a minor annoyance, but a genuine obstacle. A job you didn't get. A diagnosis you didn't expect. A relationship that collapsed. A business that failed. A plan that fell apart at the exact moment you thought you'd finally arrived. In that moment, what did the obstacle feel like? For most of us, it feels like a wall. Something solid and immovable standing between us and the life we wanted. We treat it as an interruption of the story, a detour, an insult, proof that the universe is against us. And so we do the natural thing. We panic, or we complain, or we freeze, or we look for someone to blame. We wait for the obstacle to go away so that our real life can resume. Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle is the Way, is built around a quietly radical claim that reverses all of that. It says the obstacle is not standing in the way of your life. The obstacle is the way. The very thing blocking you is the path forward, if you know how to look at it and how to work with it. The problem you are cursing is also the raw material of your growth, your reputation, your character, and sometimes your greatest opportunity. This is not a slogan Holiday invented. It is an idea nearly 2,000 years old, drawn from the Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome, and Holiday's project in this book is to take that ancient idea down from the shelf, blow the dust off it, and show that it still works, that it is in fact one of the most practical tools ever devised for a human being trying to get through a hard life. What makes the book compelling is that it does not ask you to be happier about your problems or to pretend they don't hurt. It asks you to do something much more useful. It asks you to change your relationship to adversity so completely that you stop being its victim and start being its user. Over the next stretch of time, I want to walk through what this book actually argues, where it comes from, and why so many people, from athletes to executives to soldiers to ordinary strugglers, have found it to be a kind of operating manual for turning trials into fuel. Because the promise here is enormous. It is the promise that nothing that happens to you, no matter how bad, has to be wasted. Ryan Holiday came to this material in an unusual way. He was not a philosophy professor or a monk. He was a young, ambitious media strategist who dropped out of college and went to work in the fast, aggressive world of marketing and public relations. He worked for the clothing company American Apparel during its turbulent years and made a name for himself as someone who understood how attention and manipulation and controversy actually functioned in the modern world. He was, by his own account, brash and hungry and often cynical. Somewhere along the way, a mentor handed him the writings of the Stoics, and they changed the direction of his life. He began carrying a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius everywhere, marking it up, returning to it in hard moments, treating it not as a museum piece, but as a living guide. That personal history matters because it shapes the entire tone of the book. Holiday is not writing as a detached scholar explaining a dead philosophy. He is writing as a practitioner, someone who reaches for these ideas when his own life gets difficult, and who wants to make them usable for people who will never read a word of ancient Greek. The whole Stoic tradition, in his hands, becomes less a set of doctrines to memorize and more a set of exercises to run. The title itself comes from a single line in the private journal of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a man who ruled the largest empire on earth while battling plague, war, betrayal, and chronic illness, and who wrote notes to himself late at night to keep his own mind steady. In one of those notes he observed, in effect, that the mind adapts and converts obstacles into fuel for action, that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. Holiday takes that compressed insight and expands it into a whole system. To do that, he leans on three great Stoic teachers whose lives could not have been more different. There is Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world. There is Seneca, a wealthy statesman and advisor to emperors who was eventually ordered to take his own life. And there is Epictetus, who was born a slave, was physically crippled by a cruel master, and went on to become one of the most influential philosophers in history. An emperor, a statesman, and a former slave, all arriving at the same conclusions about how to live. That range is part of Holiday's point. Stoicism is not a philosophy for one type of person in one type of circumstance. It is designed for the human condition itself. The book is organized around 3 disciplines that the Stoics believed we must master: perception, action, and will. These 3 are the spine of the entire argument, and understanding them is understanding the book. Let me take them one at a time. Perception is where everything begins, because it is where the obstacle first arrives. Before an event can defeat us, it has to be interpreted by us. The Stoics observed something that modern psychology would later confirm in great detail. It is not events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about those events. 2 people can face the exact same setback and experience 2 entirely different realities. One sees catastrophe and is paralyzed. The other sees a challenge, an inconvenience, or even an opportunity, and gets to work. The event was identical. The perception was not. Holiday argues that most of the power an obstacle holds over us is power we hand it through our perception. When we label something a disaster, we make it a disaster in our minds long before it has actually harmed us. When we let emotion flood in and take over, we lose access to the very faculties, reason and clear sight, that we most need in a crisis. So the first discipline is learning to control perception. Not by denying reality, but by refusing to add to it. The Stoics practice seeing things as they are, stripped of the panicked stories we wrap around them. A lost deal is a lost deal. It is not the end of your career unless you decide it is. A crucial part of this discipline is what Holiday, following the Stoics, calls objectivity. When our own life is on the line, we lose perspective instantly. We catastrophize. But if a friend brought us the same problem, we would often see it clearly and calmly and offer good advice. The trick is to treat your own situation with that same outside eye, to look at your problem as if it belonged to someone else, to strip away the ego and the fear and just assess what is actually true. Is anyone dead? Is this actually fatal, or does it merely feel that way? Very often the honest answer is that the situation is survivable, workable, even minor compared to what it felt like in the first hot rush of emotion. Another pillar of perception is the dichotomy of control, perhaps the single most important idea in all of Stoicism. Epictetus taught that some things are within our power and some things are not. Within our power are our own opinions, our choices, our efforts, our responses. Outside our power are events, other people, outcomes, reputation, and fortune. Almost all human misery, the Stoics argued, comes from confusing these 2 categories, from investing our peace of mind in things we cannot control while neglecting the one thing we can, which is how we choose to respond. When an obstacle appears, the disciplined mind does not waste energy raging at the parts it cannot change. It immediately asks, "What here is up to me?" And then it pours everything into that. Holiday illustrates all of this with figures like John D. Rockefeller, who as a young man watching a financial panic destroy those around him trained himself to stay cold and clear while everyone else lost their heads, and who later described the crises of his life as his great teachers. He tells the story of Reuben Hurricane Carter, the boxer wrongly imprisoned for murder, who refused to accept the identity of prisoner in his own mind even while his body was locked up, who declined to wear the uniform or accept the privileges that would have implied he consented to his own captivity, who used the years to educate himself and hold on to his freedom internally until he could win it back externally. The obstacle of a prison cell could not touch the one territory he refused to surrender, which was his own perception of who he was. The discipline of perception, then, is the foundation. It does not solve the problem, but it clears the fog, calms the storm, and lets us actually see the obstacle for what it is, which is a necessary precondition for doing anything intelligent about it. As Holiday puts it, we choose the glasses through which we see the world. And that choice, made well, is the beginning of turning any obstacle into a road. Perception clears the way, but perception alone is not enough. Plenty of people can see a situation clearly and still do nothing. So the second discipline is action. And Holiday is emphatic that Stoicism, despite its reputation as a philosophy of passive endurance, is intensely, aggressively action-oriented. The Stoics were doers. Marcus ran an empire. Seneca ran the affairs of state. These were not men sitting on cushions detaching from the world. They were in the arena. The kind of action Holiday describes has particular qualities. It is directed, it is persistent, and it is courageous. When an obstacle appears, the disciplined response is not to wait for perfect conditions or a guarantee of success. It is to get moving, to try something, to attack the problem from whatever angle is available right now. Fortune, the Stoics noticed, tends to favor the person who is already in motion. Standing still and hoping is not a strategy. Boldness, even imperfect boldness, opens doors that timidity never will. A central theme within action is the willingness to fail and to treat failure as feedback rather than verdict. Holiday returns often to the example of Thomas Edison, who ran through thousands of failed experiments on his way to a working light bulb and who reframed every one of them not as a defeat, but as one more way ruled out, one more step toward the answer. Failure, in this frame, is not the opposite of progress. It is the mechanism of progress. Each obstacle you fail against teaches you something about the obstacle, so that your next attempt is smarter. The person who has failed 100 times knows the terrain better than the person who has never tried. Holiday also emphasizes persistence over intensity, the grinding, unglamorous willingness to keep going long after the initial enthusiasm has burned off. He tells the story of Ulysses S. Grant during the American Civil War, whose long, patient, relentless campaigns wore down opponents that flashier generals could not beat. He writes about the value of doing the work in front of you, thoroughly and well, even when it is humble, even when no one is watching, because reputations and skills and breakthroughs are built out of countless unremarkable actions done properly. Related to this is the idea of following the process. When a task or an obstacle is overwhelming, the mind seizes up at the sheer size of it. The antidote is to stop staring at the mountain and instead focus only on the next step, and then the next, and then the next. Holiday borrows this from the world of sports, where great coaches teach athletes to ignore the scoreboard and the championship and the pressure, and to concentrate entirely on executing this one play, this one drill, this one small thing they can control right now. The process is a way of making the impossible merely difficult, and the difficult merely a series of manageable actions. You do not have to solve everything today. You have to do the next right thing today. There is also, within the discipline of action, a strategic intelligence. Sometimes the direct assault on an obstacle is not the answer. Holiday describes the value of the indirect approach, of finding the angle, of using the obstacle's own momentum against it the way a smaller fighter uses an opponent's force. He tells of Demosthenes, the ancient Athenian who was born with a weak body and a stammer, who could not speak in public without being laughed off the stage, and who did not try to become someone else. Instead, he attacked the exact weakness that shamed him. He built an underground study, shaved half his head so he would be too embarrassed to go out and would have to stay and practice, spoke with pebbles in his mouth to master his enunciation, and trained his voice against the roar of the ocean. He turned the precise obstacle that defined his limitation into the arena of his greatest mastery, and became the finest orator of his age. The impediment became the path. The weakness, worked on relentlessly, became the strength. Action, in Holiday's telling, is where perception becomes real. It is not enough to see the opportunity inside the obstacle. You have to move toward it, fail toward it, grind toward it, and be willing to do so for a long time. Energy plus persistence plus a clear head. That is how obstacles get turned, not into wishes, but into results. The third discipline is the deepest and, in some ways, the hardest. It is will. And here Holiday makes an important distinction. Not everything can be solved by perception, and not everything can be overcome by action. Some obstacles simply cannot be moved. A terminal illness. The death of someone we love. An injustice we do not have the power to reverse. A situation where all the clear thinking and all the bold effort in the world will not change the outcome. What then? This is where the discipline of will comes in, because will is the internal power we have when external power runs out. Perception governs how we see, action governs how we respond to what we can affect, but will governs how we endure what we cannot change at all. It is the fortitude, the inner citadel, the part of a person that cannot be conquered no matter what the world does to the body or the circumstances. Holiday describes will as the one thing that is fully and always ours, the last and deepest territory of human freedom. A central practice of the discipline of will is preparation for adversity. The Stoics did something that sounds grim, but is actually liberating. They regularly contemplated the worst that could happen. They rehearsed loss, failure, and death in their minds, not to be morbid, but to rob those things of their power to ambush and destroy them. If you have already, calmly, imagined losing everything, then when hardship comes it does not shatter you, because you were not living in the fantasy that it could never happen. The Stoics called part of this the premeditation of evils, the practice of expecting difficulty so that difficulty finds you ready rather than blindsided. Holiday argues that so much of our suffering comes from our expectation that life should be easy and fair, and that when we drop that expectation and prepare instead for a world that includes hardship, we become almost impossible to break. Another pillar of will is acceptance, and specifically the profound Stoic idea of amor fati, the love of fate. This goes far beyond mere tolerance of what happens. It is the practice of not just accepting but embracing everything that occurs, including the painful and the unwanted, as if we had chosen it. The disciplined person does not merely put up with their fate. They learn to say yes to it, to work with it, even to love it, because it is the only reality they have been given, and fighting it changes nothing except their own peace. Holiday points to Edison again, who at nearly 70 years old watched his research laboratory burn to the ground, and rather than collapse into despair, calmly took it in, told his son to go get his mother, because she would never see a fire like this again, and remarked that all their mistakes had just been burned up so they could start fresh. That is amor fati in the flesh. Not a denial of the disaster, but a refusal to be destroyed by it, and an immediate turning of the ashes into a beginning. The discipline of will also involves something larger than the self. Holiday writes about the importance of perspective beyond our own small lives, the recognition that we are part of something bigger, that others have suffered before us and endured, that our story is not the only story. It involves meditating on our own mortality, not as a source of dread, but as a source of urgency and gratitude. Remembering that we will die, the Stoics believed, is what makes us finally serious about living, about not wasting our days on trivial resentments and petty fears. And it involves a kind of humility, an understanding that we do not control the outcome, only our conduct, and that a life well lived is measured by how we carried ourselves, not by whether fortune happened to smile on us. Will, then, is what remains when everything else has been stripped away. It is the endurance that allows a person to be crushed by circumstance and still not be defeated, to lose the battle in the world and still win the battle inside. And it prepares us, finally, for the truth that there will always be another obstacle. The disciplines are not a one-time cure. They are a practice, repeated for a lifetime, because life keeps sending us new walls to turn into roads. Before pulling the threads together, it is worth pausing on what makes this more than a collection of motivational stories, because that is where the book earns its weight. Underneath the three disciplines is a coherent view of what a human life is and what we owe it. The Stoics believed that virtue, meaning wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline, was the only true good, and that everything else, wealth, health, reputation, comfort, was what they called indifferent. Not worthless, but not the point. The point was always how you conducted yourself. This reframing is quietly revolutionary when applied to obstacles. If the goal of life were pleasure or success or the absence of difficulty, then every obstacle would be a pure loss, an enemy of the good life. But if the goal of life is the exercise of virtue, of becoming a certain kind of person, then obstacles are not the enemy of the good life at all. They are the occasion for it. You cannot practice courage without something to fear. You cannot practice patience without delay, or resilience without setback, or justice without the temptation to do wrong. The obstacle is not an interruption of the project of building character. The obstacle is the material the project is built from. This is why Holiday can say, and mean it literally, that the obstacle is the way. There is no other way. The path to the person you want to become runs directly through the difficulties you would rather avoid. It also explains why the book insists we stop asking why bad things happen to us and start asking what we will do with them. The Stoics were not interested in the cosmic fairness of events, which they considered outside our control and therefore not worth our anguish. They were intensely interested in our response, which is the one place our freedom actually lives. This is a profound shift of the center of gravity of a life, away from what happens to me and toward what I make of it. And it is available to anyone, in any circumstance, at any moment, which is exactly why an emperor, a statesman, and a former slave could all arrive at the same place. So what should a person actually carry away from this book and put to use? Let me draw out the most important lessons in a way you can hold on to. The first takeaway is that the obstacle contains the opportunity. This is the master idea, and it is not naive optimism. It is a discipline of looking. Inside almost every difficulty there is an advantage, a lesson, an opening, a chance to build a strength or a reputation or a capability you would never have developed otherwise. The obstacle that blocks the easy road often forces you onto a better one. Your job is not to wish the obstacle away, but to search it, actively and creatively, for the door it is hiding. The second takeaway is that you control your response and almost nothing else, and that this is enough. Events, other people, and outcomes are largely outside your power. Your judgments, your effort, and your conduct are entirely inside it. Peace and effectiveness both come from pouring your energy into that inner territory and letting go of the rest. Every minute spent raging at what you cannot change is a minute stolen from what you can. The third takeaway is that perception is a choice and emotion is not a strategy. The story you tell yourself about a setback determines how much power it has over you. Strip away the panic, the self-pity, and the catastrophizing. Look at the situation as coldly and objectively as you would if it belonged to a friend, and most obstacles shrink to a workable size. Stay calm on purpose. Clarity is a competitive advantage. The fourth takeaway is that action, persistent and bold, is the engine that turns perception into results. Get moving. Try things. Treat failure as data, not as verdict. Follow the process by focusing on the next small step rather than the overwhelming whole. And keep going long after the initial motivation fades, because most obstacles fall not to a single dramatic blow, but to relentless, patient, unglamorous pressure. The fifth takeaway is that some things cannot be beaten and must instead be endured, and that endurance is its own kind of victory. When action fails, will remains. Prepare in advance for hardship so it cannot ambush you. Practice accepting and even loving your fate rather than fighting a reality you cannot change. Remember your own mortality to keep your priorities honest. The person who cannot be broken on the inside has a freedom that no external force can take. And the sixth takeaway, the one that gives the whole thing its momentum, is that this is a practice, not a destination. You will get knocked down again. There will always be a next obstacle. The goal is not to reach a life without difficulty, but to become the kind of person who meets difficulty well, over and over, so that each obstacle leaves you not diminished but larger. What blocks the path becomes the path. What stands in the way becomes the way. There is a reason this small book has ended up in the lockers of professional athletes, in the rucksacks of soldiers, on the desks of entrepreneurs, and in the hands of ordinary people quietly enduring hard seasons of their lives. It is because it offers something rare, which is a way of living that does not depend on your luck improving. Most advice about happiness and success is secretly conditional. It works if you get the promotion, if you win the game, if the diagnosis is good, if the world cooperates. Ryan Holiday, channeling 2,000 years of Stoic wisdom, offers something that works even when the world does not cooperate, especially when the world does not cooperate. That is a philosophy you can actually rely on, because it is built for exactly the moments when everything else fails you. The invitation of this book is not to become cold or detached or to pretend that pain does not hurt. It is to stop being at the mercy of your circumstances and to start treating every hardship as raw material. The failed venture becomes the education that makes the next one succeed. The illness becomes the teacher of what actually matters. The insult becomes the test of your composure. The wall becomes the road. None of it has to be wasted. That is the promise, and it is a serious one. So the next time something goes badly wrong, and it will, because that is simply what life is, you have a choice about what to do with it. You can treat it as an interruption, a piece of bad luck, an enemy to be resented until it goes away. Or you can remember the ancient line at the heart of this book and get to work, because the impediment to action can advance action, and what stands in the way can become the way. The obstacle in front of you right now is not the thing keeping you from the life you want. Looked at correctly and worked on with a clear mind, a persistent hand, and an unbreakable will, that obstacle is the way to it. It always was.